In this video series, we're going to be talking about the new architecture of the 20th century. After World War I, architects in Europe and the United States were full of new ideas. They now thought of buildings not only as prototypes for the future of architecture, but also as an integral part of their surroundings, whether rural or suburban or urban. Simplicity, masking, organized complexity was the new order of today. We'll start with European modernism, and in Europe, a stripped down and severely geometric style of modern architecture would develop. And why? Well, like most art and architecture, we see it as a reaction, and particularly with this, it's a reaction to the natural organic lines that were found in Art Nouveau. The most important of the French modern architects was Le Corbusier, originally named Charles-Édouard Générat. He took on the pseudonym in the 1920s. He was the most influential architect of the next half of the century, and his Villa Savoye, a private home outside of the city of Paris, would become an icon of the international style of the time. What is the international style? Well, in the international style, the term was created in 1932. It was organized by a group of architectural historians such as Henry Russell Hitchcock and an architect and curator named Philip Johnson. And there they came up with three fundamental principles of style. And the first was the conception of architecture as volume rather than mass. That is, the use of a structural skeleton of steel and ferroconcrete, and that would eliminate load-bearing walls on both the exterior and interior. And as a result of this, a building could be wrapped in skins of glass or metal or masonry and create the effect of an enclosed space, volume, rather than the dense material, the mass. And interiors where free-flowing plans could provide maximum flexibility in the organizing of the space. The second principle was the regularity rather than symmetry as the chief means of ordering the design. That is, the distribution of structural supports and the use of standard building parts, promoting rectangular regularity rather than the balance of axial symmetry that we would find in classical architecture. And our third and final principle was the rejection of arbitrary applied decoration. This new architecture depending on the intrinsic elegance of its material and the formal arrangements of its elements to produce harmonious and aesthetic effects. The international style originated in the Netherlands with the De Stijl, France known as Purism, and the German architectural style known as Bauhaus. And it was in 1932 that it would spread to the United States. So in this building we see Le Corbusier's purist style coming out, and in its geometric design and its avoidance of ornamentation. Le Corbusier did a domino construction system in which the slab of ferroconcrete, that's concrete reinforced with rebar, rests on top of 6 freestanding steel posts placed at the position of the 6 dots that we would see on a domino playing piece. Over the next 10 years, our architect would further explore the possibilities of this domino system. He would also write a book in 1926 called The 5 Points of a New Architecture, in which he would propose that all homes be raised above the ground on pilotis, that is freestanding posts, using flat roofs as terraces and using movable partition walls with slotted in between to support the interior. We would call these curtain walls, which are non-load-bearing walls, and on the exterior to allow a greater design flexibility. And these would become common features of the modern architecture. After World War I, like his fellow modern architects, Le Corbusier also developed design for mass-produced standardized housing to help rebuild Europe after its destruction of the Great War for its infrastructure. So let's leave Europe and let's go to America and let's discuss American modernism. And with American modernism, we have the most influential architect in the world during the early 20th century, and that's Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright and several other architects in Oak Park, Chicago, which is a suburb, created a school together. This was known as the Prairie School. And they began to look at designing low, horizontal style houses with flat roofs and heavy overhangs that would echo the flat plains of the prairie in the Midwest. Wright had an uneasy relationship with European modernist architects. He was totally not interested in the machine aesthetics of Le Corbusier, and although he routinely used new building materials such as ferroconcrete, plate glass, and steel, his goal was to maintain a natural sensibility, connecting his buildings to the building site by using like local wood, local stone, and brick. And the best example of this is his famous falling water. This was built in rural Pennsylvania. It's a good example of this practice. It is also one of the most famous expressions of Wright's conviction that a building or a home should not simply sit on the landscape, but should coordinate with the landscape. Falling Water was commissioned by Edgar Kaufman, who was a wealthy Pittsburgh department store owner, and the idea was to replace the Kaufman family summer cottage, which was on the side of a waterfall and a pool that the family played in. Wright decided to build the new house right into the cliff and over the pool, thus allowing the waterfall to flow around as well as under the house. The large boulder where the family had sunbathed during the summer times was used for the central hearthstone of the fireplace. Wright used cantilevers to extend a series of broad concrete terraces out from the cliff that would parallel the great slabs of natural rock below. He poured concrete forms to create the terraces and painted the material a soft earth tone. In this house we see long bands of windows and glass doors offered spectacular views, and the idea was to unite the water, the house, and the wood. And the end goal of this particular structure was to create something that's living in harmony with nature. And thus Wright is declaring war on the modern city. And when asked, about how could we improve city architecture, he simply said, tear it all down. So after World War II, the international style, with its plainly visible structures, its rejection of historicism, dominated the new urban construction in much of the world. And what we see is an evolution of modernist architecture. And they settled into a form that largely came to stand for corporate power as well as wealth. Several major European international style architects, such as Walter Gropius, would leave Europe and migrate to the United States, and they would assume important roles in architectural schools where they would train the next generation of architects. A good example of what we would see in mid-century modernism to postmodernism architecture is the Trans World Airlines terminal that was located at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. The architect of this was Eero Saarinen. He's Finnish-born, American architect, and he would break all the barriers of postmodern architecture. And what he sought to evoke was the thrill as well as the glamour of air travel by giving the TWA terminal its roof two broad canopies that look like wings. He would do this with reinforced concrete that suggested a huge bird about to take flight. The interior consisted of large, open, dramatically flowing spaces. If you Google search the TWA, you'll see old photographs of it. And Saarinen designed each detail of the interior of this building, from the ticket counter to telephone booths, to complement his sort of gull-winged shelled structure. Another example of mid-century modernist architecture is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. I probably made that name, just slaughtered it, but it's what I do well. He created one of the most extreme examples of post-war international style. He was a former Bauhaus teacher. He migrated before or from Nazi Germany. And he designed the rectilinear glass towers that would become this sort of poster child for post-war capitalism. The building we see here is the Seagram building. It epitomizes the standardization, the impersonal behavior that became synonymous with the modern corporation. The architect's efficient construction methods and use of materials are seen in the structure. It allowed the architect to pack an immense amount of office space into a building on a very small piece of property. Criticized for building relatively unadorned glass boxes, Mies advocated the idea of less is more, and the use of non-functional decorative bronze beams on the outside of this building, the Seagram building, to echo the functional beams inside, give the facade, that is the outside, a sleek, rich, and dignified appearance. And finally, let's end with our postmodern architecture for this particular house, designed by Venturi, Roche, and Scott Brown. Again, we're going to put this house in a rural setting in Delaware, and this is called the Newcastle County, and wood frame stucco house. Now, this house was designed for a family of 3. The wife was a musician. There would be pianos and organs and instruments found in it, and the husband was an avid bird watcher, so he wanted large windows that would be facing towards the woods. Now, this house is postmodern, but what we see is a mix of historical styles. Why? Because the architect liked post-Renaissance architectural elements and the Baroque architecture as well. And rather than simply copy, he borrowed freely. And so what he did with this house is that he would juxtapose elements, architectural elements, he would create collages, and he reinterpreted forms from various periods and plans. The exterior looks conventional, but then there's this sort of odd placed arch, for example. And he would say, well, this was inspired, as you look at the image here, from the Baroque. But if you really take a close look at it, it looks like a Victorian garden gate. It has sort of that eyebrow effect. But when you look at it from the side, you see this sort of why does it belong here? But when you look at it from the front, it looks like it blends into the house. For Venturi, his commentary on international style is he believed that less is a bore. He's inspired by driving the main streets of Las Vegas. He wants things to kind of jump out and not be sort of coherent from one point to another point.